A whisper lingered behind the cracked mirror, not of ghosts, but of truths too long buried in silence. A forgotten portrait, a shot in the corridor, and a legacy unraveling in oil and ash. What happens when honor becomes a mask and memory the sharpest blade of all? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. There are mornings in Baker Street when even the coal fire cannot dispel the gloom. On such a day in early October, I found my friend Sherlock Holmes in one of his blacker moods, silent for hours on end, his lean figure cast in shadow beside the window, his violin resting untouched by the hearth. The rain tapped a slow dirge upon the panes, and not even the Times, nor the stale crumpets from Mrs. Hudson could stir him. I knew better than to interrupt these phases of abstraction, for they often preceded some case of exceptional singularity, or followed the disappointment of an ordinary one. It was nearing the 11:15 when a sharp, urgent knock broke the silence. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, her brows furrowed and her voice low. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Refuses to give her name. She's soaked through and trembling." Holmes stirred for the first time in hours. "Send her in." The door opened to admit a woman veiled in black, her gloved hands clutching something tightly beneath her cloak. Her dress was modest, but finely cut, though splashed with mud and travel wear. She entered not with the hesitation of the timid, but the restraint of someone desperately holding herself together. She stepped forward, unwrapping the bundle in her arms with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. From the folds of a dark silk cloth, she drew out a mirror, oval in shape, framed in faded gilt, and most strikingly, cracked clean through the centre. "I ask your pardon," she said in a low voice, "but I believe this may concern a matter of life or death. The mirror belonged to my father. I found it hidden, in a place that should never have been opened." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes already alight with interest. "And you fear," he said softly, "that what it reflected may yet return?" She said nothing, but tightened her grip on the mirror. That silence was answer enough. Holmes rose and took 2 paces forward, his gaze sweeping her form without rudeness but with frightening precision. "Your left glove is inside out," he said. "A hurried dressing. The hem of your skirt is torn, likely from thorn or latch, suggesting you crossed something overgrown or locked, and you wear the faintest perfume of jasmine, though underneath it, linseed oil. Curious." She began. "No need," Holmes said, waving his hand. "You changed somewhere en route. The mirror, I suspect, was not meant to travel. You brought it, Miss—" Her lips parted, but she remained silent. Holmes only smiled. "Very well. You shall remain unnamed for now." There was no malice in the woman. Of that I was immediately sure, but there was fear, thick as smoke in her every word and gesture. Holmes seemed to detect the same. "You are not here to conceal a crime," he said, "but to understand one, or perhaps to prevent it." Still veiled, she nodded once, quickly. Her gloved hands now rested on her lap, but did not leave the mirror. "There is something," she whispered, "behind the glass. Something I was never meant to see. I don't mean a ghost, Doctor. I don't believe in ghosts. But I swear to you, someone has tampered with that mirror. I found it sealed behind a wall in my father's house, and I believe it is watching me." Holmes looked down at the fractured surface, then back at the trembling form before us. "Miss," he said gently, "you have come to the right place, and you are correct in one thing already." She looked up. "This is no ordinary mirror. I am Helena Fitzmaurice," the woman said at last, her voice calm but weary, as if the name itself bore weight. "Of Glassford Hall in Sussex, daughter of the late Sir Reginald Fitzmaurice." I confess I blinked in recognition. The name had appeared in the obituary column only months prior, and not without whispers attached. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Ah," he said, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "Then I am doubly glad you came. She folded her gloved hands on her lap, as one might do in church, not from piety, but to keep them from trembling. "There has been a death," she continued. "Another, my brother. And the mirror you now hold was found in the room where he died." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then the question, Miss Fitzmaurice, is not why you are here, but why you waited. My brother Edwin returned from the Cape last year," Helena began, her tone steadying. "He was not well. Something changed in him. A restlessness, a haunted look in the eyes. Shortly after our father passed, Edwin insisted on staying at the Hall, even though I preferred London." She paused, gathering herself. "There is a chamber on the upper floor, my mother's old room. It had been sealed for nearly 20 years, ever since—" Her voice wavered. "Ever since her death?" I offered gently. She nodded. "Father had it shut and nailed after her suicide. Edwin knew this, yet he ordered it reopened. I objected, but he had authority. The day before he died, I found the room unlocked again, and inside, covered by a cloth and braced behind the dresser, was the mirror. This mirror," she gestured to the cracked relic before us. "My father always swore it brought ruin. He had it sealed away with her. Now I wonder if he wasn't wrong." Holmes regarded the mirror as one might a dangerous book. "Objects, Miss Fitzmaurice, have no power," he said, "but secrets most assuredly do." "There was something else," Helena added, reaching into her satchel. She produced a small folded slip of yellowing paper. This was wedged into the wooden backing. Holmes took it delicately. The paper was brittle, and the writing upon it had faded with time. The ink had bled along the fibres, but the message, though partial, was still discernible. "Not forget the promise. You swore he would have a name. I cannot be cast away like—" There was no signature, only a bold, slashing A. Holmes examined it in silence, then turned the paper over and held it up to the gaslight. "No watermark," he murmured, "but the ink is iron gall, common in the late 1870s. And the script, feminine but practiced. The hand of someone educated." Helena bit her lip. "My mother's name was Anne." Holmes's eyes did not leave the letter. "And who in the house knew of this note's existence before today?" "No one," she said. "I haven't told a soul." Holmes gave a brief smile. "Then let us see how long it stays that way." "There is something else," Helena continued, after a long moment. "Twice now, since returning, I have entered that room and seen, not something, but someone." Holmes looked up. "A face," she whispered, "reflected in the mirror. Not mine, not Edwin's. A man, standing behind me, though when I turned, the room was empty." "Did he speak?" "No, he watched, or rather, he waited." Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully. "Was the crack present then?" "Yes, it runs directly across the glass." Yet the face appeared undistorted. I confess, a chill ran up my spine at the notion. Holmes, ever composed, asked, "What lies behind the wall upon which the mirror rests?" "Stone. There is no other room." "Then, Miss Fitzmaurice," Holmes said, "we are dealing with either a clever illusion or a lie that has taken on shape and breath. My cousin, Colonel Archibald Thwaite, is my late father's executor," Helena said. "He manages the estate in Edwin's absence, or rather did." "Ah," said Holmes, "a military man. And what is his view of these events?" "He says I am overwrought, that the mirror is a remnant of grief, and the face a trick of the mind." "And you?" Holmes asked. "I believe he knows more than he says. He was my father's confidant, and he fought to keep that room sealed, even after father's death." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Men who fear objects generally fear what they've hidden behind them." Holmes turned back to the mirror, his gaze flicking from crack to gilded edge. "You came by train," he said. "First class, judging by your gloves. But you changed your garments en route. The faint line of steam pressing on your coat betrays it. And the scent of linseed suggests the case which once held this mirror was oiled before the journey. But you left the case behind." Helena looked at him, astonished. "You wanted to draw attention," Holmes continued. "Not from us, but from someone else, someone who would follow." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Holmes had caught her mid-thought, as he so often did. "I was watched," she said quietly. "At Victoria Station, a man in black. He vanished before I could reach a constable. Which is why," Holmes concluded, "you came not only with evidence, but with bait." Holmes leaned forward, fingertips steepled, eyes glinting with that rare energy which signalled a mind already 10 moves ahead. "Miss Fitzmaurice, this mirror is not merely a relic. It is a signal. Someone hid it, someone sought it, and now someone fears what it may reveal. You, unwittingly or not, have set the match to kindling." "And what will it burn?" she asked. "That," Holmes replied, "depends entirely on who arrives first, the seeker or the truth." He turned to me then. "Watson, I think a trip to Sussex is in order, but we shall not go as ourselves." Helena looked between us. "Then you believe me?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Miss Fitzmaurice, I believe the mirror. And it tells me the game has only just begun." It was Holmes' idea, of course, that we should approach Glassford Hall not as ourselves, but as a pair of London antique dealers. I had barely questioned the absurdity of this ruse before he had procured for us a pair of forged cards and a battered case of catalogues, presumably borrowed from some obliging pawnbroker in Clerkenwell. "Suspicion," he murmured, "is best disarmed by the ordinary." And so it was that we arrived at the Sussex estate by hired trap. Holmes dressed in a rather convincing waistcoat frayed at the edges, his manner that of a man more interested in a 17th century table leg than any unfolding tragedy. I confess I found the charade mildly absurd, but Holmes played his role with relish. "You will observe, Watson," he whispered as we neared the gates, "that sometimes it is not the house that hides its secrets, but the people who pretend to live honestly within it." Glassford Hall stood as a monument to faded grandeur, ivy-strangled gables, leaded windows dulled by years of neglect, and a driveway that gave the impression it had once hosted far grander visitors than ourselves. Within, the house seemed to sigh with age. The corridors were lined with oil portraits whose eyes followed one's passing with mournful judgment, and the furniture, all of dark oak and heavy lines, seemed to resent intrusion. I could not help but note the absence of warmth, not simply in temperature, though the hearths lay cold, but in spirit. It was a place preserved, not lived in. Holmes made a show of admiring a grotesquely carved armoire in the entryway, but I knew his eyes missed nothing. "There are houses," he said, "where history lingers like perfume, and others, Watson, where it festers like a wound." A faint sound, a creak above perhaps, broke the hush. Holmes paused only a moment before continuing with a theatrical murmur about Jacobean woodwork. If the house had ghosts, I thought, they kept to their corners and watched us very carefully. Colonel Archibald Thwaite received us in the drawing-room with a stiffness that could have been mistaken for dignity had it not been so clearly practiced. He was tall, lean, with the fixed jaw of a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. "My late cousin had little use for dealers," he said, scanning our false credentials with distaste. "But I suppose some arrangement can be made, provided you stay out of the family rooms." Holmes offered a deferential bow and murmured something about Chippendale sideboards. It was then that the housekeeper entered. Mrs. Drennan, a woman of uncertain age and a countenance carved from stone. Her greeting was no warmer than the Colonel's, but her eyes flicked to Holmes with unmistakable calculation. Holmes, for his part, addressed her with syrupy politeness. "Madam," he said, "this house is rich with narrative. I hope we do not disturb it too greatly." "Some stories," she replied, "ought to stay in the walls where they belong." I caught Holmes' slight smile. The housekeeper at least knew how to speak in riddles. It was under the pretext of assessing a walnut escritoire that Holmes contrived a moment alone in the upstairs chamber, the one that had been sealed since the death of Helena's mother. The lock, he noted, had been recently tampered with. The hinges, though old, bore faint scratches from a screwdriver, and upon entering, the air held not the must of 2 decades, but the faint char of spent fire. Holmes moved swiftly but silently, eyes scanning every corner with that peculiar glint he wore when the hunt was fresh. He paused at the hearth, boarded up, yet a smear of soot betrayed recent use. A faint footprint, pressed into the dust before the mantel, was half a size too large for Helena, and certainly too fine for any servant. He drew out his lens, examined the boards behind the mirror, and murmured, shifted, and recently. Perhaps someone came to retrieve something, I ventured. Or to hide it, he replied. Holmes straightened and turned to me. The ghost in the mirror, Watson, may have no need of doors, but the man who placed him there most assuredly does. And with that, we descended the stairs in silence. It was after luncheon, as Holmes busied himself with examining soot samples in the yard, that I found myself in the stables, ostensibly admiring the thoroughbreds. There I encountered a lad no more than 15, slight, freckled and sullen-eyed. "You tend the horses?" I asked. He nodded. "Did you know Mr. Edwin Fitzmaurice?" A pause. "Aye, sir." "Did he go into the upper rooms often?" Another pause. "Only that once. Night before he—" The boy trailed off, his eyes darting to the house. "You're safe with me, my lad," I said, lowering my voice. "Did you see anyone else near that room?" He shook his head, but too quickly, I thought. Holmes later joined me and simply asked, "Which of your boots has a split in the sole?" The boy froze. "Left," Holmes said before he could answer. "You stepped in ash." The boy's face turned pale, and he fled. While Holmes remained at the hall, I took a quiet walk to the village and made the acquaintance of Reverend Harrow, a gentle-eyed man with a fondness for ecclesiastical history and loose lips after a second glass of port. We spoke of the Fitzmaurices, and when I delicately inquired about the late Lady Fitzmaurice, he grew contemplative. "She was a striking woman," he said. "Too spirited for that house, I dare say. There were rumours." "Of what nature?" I asked. "A painter," he said at last, "from London, a Mr. Lane, I believe, hired to do her portrait, though I never saw it finished. He was seen often about the place. After her death, Sir Reginald had all her belongings removed or destroyed. Lane vanished." "Do you believe the scandal was real?" "I believe," the vicar said gently, "that some men can forgive many things, but not the loss of control over their legacy." As I returned to the hall, I wondered whether the face Helena had glimpsed in the mirror was not a ghost, but the echo of a man whose brush had once dared paint the truth. Holmes had been unusually quiet when I returned, but I should have recognized that glint in his eye, the one he wore when a pattern was forming in that labyrinthine mind of his. "I took the liberty," he said, "of examining the library. Antique dealers are permitted such trespasses." He led me to a forgotten corner, past shelves of unread ledgers, and gestured to a large wooden crate marked with a faint, almost effaced shipping stamp. With great care, he lifted the lid and revealed what lay within. It was a mirror, identical in size and design to the cracked one Helena had brought, save that its glass was whole and clear. "Why hide it?" I asked. "Because this one was never meant to be found," Holmes replied. "Or rather, it was meant to replace the other." He tapped the back of the frame. "And note the thin layer of dust on the inner rim. It was moved, but recently." He looked at me then. "We are not dealing with a single mirror, Watson, but a substitution. And the question is, Kurt, what image needed so badly to be erased?" That evening, Holmes returned once more to the sealed chamber, this time with a small tin of lampblack and a feather brush. He worked in silence, tracing lines along the inner bricks of the fireplace. At last, he stepped back. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The mortar here is newer than the rest, just this segment." I peered closer and saw that he was right. A narrow rectangle at the base bore a faint difference in hue and scent, the faintest aroma of burnt oil. The hearth, Holmes continued, was used within the last month, possibly within the week. But it was sealed, I objected. Poorly, he replied, and intentionally, likely to simulate disuse. Someone kindled a fire here, not for warmth, but to destroy something. The portrait. Possibly, or a letter, perhaps both. He turned back to the room. One man feared this chamber, another returned to it. One sought to forget, the other to remember. And which are we aiding? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. That depends, Watson, on who walks through that mirror, and who shatters it first. It was Holmes who first noted the discrepancy in Mrs. Drennan's routine. On the second morning of our stay, he whispered to me, while dusting the corner of a fireplace with a quill, "Observe the housekeeper, Watson. She takes her basket, but gathers no eggs." Curious, I followed his instruction and remained at the stair while Holmes vanished through the garden. He returned before breakfast, brushing pine needles from his trousers with the same indifference he reserved for threats of violence. "I shall require your company tonight," he said. "Bring no lantern." Thus it was, under the cover of moonless gloom, that we crept beyond the kitchen garden, down the trail that led into the edge of the woods behind Glassford Hall. There, amidst gnarled oaks and damp earth, we saw Mrs. Drennan pause and glance about. A moment later, a cloaked man emerged from the trees. They exchanged a letter, she pressing it into his gloved hand, he replying with what might have been coin. Holmes murmured, "It is not the ghosts that walk after dark in this house, Watson. It is the guilty, and those who have not yet finished their part." We confronted the stranger before he cleared the glade. Holmes stepped out with a quiet authority that forestalled any flight. "You will forgive the intrusion," he said mildly, "but I have a particular interest in your signature." The man stopped. He was of middle years, his hair more salt than pepper, and though plainly dressed, he bore himself like one unused to civility. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. "Then I have already lost." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "you may have just been found." The man introduced himself as Alfred Lane. "Once a painter," he said with dry self-mockery, "briefly employed by Sir Reginald to paint Lady Fitzmaurice's portrait before I was dismissed." "And you returned to complete unfinished work?" Holmes inquired. "Not with brushes," Lane said, tapping the breast pocket where the letter lay, "but with truth." He looked down. "The mirror. I hid it in that room before I left. I had hoped, perhaps, someone would one day find it and ask the right question." "And did they?" "Not yet." Holmes nodded. "Then perhaps we shall help them find the answer, before someone else buries it for good." Back in the guest chamber, Holmes studied the letter Lane had received from Mrs. Drennan. It was brief, scarcely more than 3 lines, but his eye lingered on each word as though it were a cipher. "She suspects. The glass was never meant to be found. If he knows, it ends." Lane sat stiffly by the mantel, his hands clasped. "It was Anne," he said. "Lady Fitzmaurice. We were foolish, I suppose. Romantic. I painted her twice, once with her daughter, once alone. But there was a third portrait, one Sir Reginald never knew of." "A child?" I asked. Lane nodded. "A boy. He had her eyes. I painted him into the mirror frame as a gift. But when your client's father found the second sketch, he had it destroyed and forced her to send me away. The boy vanished soon after." "Vanished?" "Sir Reginald claimed he died of fever. There was no burial." Holmes folded the letter. "And the cracked mirror?" "I hid it behind the plaster. Anne wrote the letter you found. I never saw her again." He looked away. "I don't know if the boy lived, but if Helena's brother found that frame, then he found more than I ever dared." Holmes rose. "Then he found the truth, and that, Mr. Lane, is often far more dangerous than lies." Holmes wasted no time. That afternoon, While the colonel occupied himself with accounts and the housekeeper played at innocence, he and I returned to the sealed room. He stood before the mirror, the cracked glass catching the light like a wound. "Observe the nails, Watson," he said, pointing to the frame. "Too recent, replaced." With the point of his penknife, he loosened the backing. Beneath the paper lining, faded glue revealed a ghost of something that once had form. "A canvas was affixed here," Holmes murmured. "A portrait, no doubt, trimmed to fit within the frame, not mounted, concealed. Could it have been of the boy? I would wager it was." He moved to the hearth and examined the grate once more. A charred scrap, missed before, was now drawn out and dusted off. It bore a corner of painted linen, sky blue, and a single brushstroke of golden hair. Holmes turned it in his hand. "They did not burn it thoroughly. Fear makes haste." He stepped back and looked at the cracked mirror. "This mirror did not shatter from time," he said quietly. "It cracked under the weight of what it once revealed. It was during one of those aimless meanderings through the upstairs gallery that I paused before a forgotten portrait, dulled by dust and years of neglect. The canvas had once borne the clear brushstrokes of a capable hand, though time had done its worst. Still, even through the fading varnish, the sitter's gaze struck me. It was not a finished portrait, I saw at once. The background vague, the lower half abandoned, yet the subject, a young girl no more than 8, stared out with that unnerving clarity so often achieved by a painter truly acquainted with his muse. There was something oddly familiar in her countenance, the tilt of the head, the sweep of auburn hair, until I realized it mirrored Helena's own. Or nearly. The child's features were softer, rounder, but unmistakably similar. Holmes joined me without word. I glanced at him, waiting for his inevitable deduction. He merely nodded once. "Good, Watson," he murmured. "Your eye improves." "Then it is Helena?" I asked. "Or someone born within minutes of her?" He said no more, but I followed as he turned on his heel, the question hanging unspoken between us. Had there once been 2 Fitzmaurice children? Later that evening, seated before the library fire with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, Holmes began to speak as though finishing a thought I hadn't heard begun. "There is no record of a twin in the family archives, nor baptismal announcements in the parish ledgers. No midwife's account, no portrait save one, unsigned and abandoned." "Then the boy never existed?" I asked. "Oh, he existed," Holmes replied, "but his existence was inconvenient." "To Sir Reginald?" "Precisely." He rose, began pacing slowly. "A child born of scandal, likely unnamed in society, perhaps even raised apart, then spirited away when he grew to resemble one who must never be named. And Helena. She may not know, or she may suspect. Either way, the mirror was no ordinary object. It once reflected a likeness, a hidden portrait. Not merely decorative, but a canvas embedded with a truth her father sought to bury. "And Edwin?" I ventured. Holmes nodded. He returned from abroad, restless, inquisitive, found the room, perhaps the portrait, and in doing so, placed himself in peril. "You believe he was silenced?" Holmes paused. "Not by a ghost, by a man who feared the past, and what it might return." He turned to me. "We must make that pass knock, and see who answers." 2 hours later, Holmes was at his most dangerous, calm, methodical, and humming a melody I could not name as he worked. On the table lay the second intact mirror we had uncovered. Its surface had been polished, its frame repaired with Holmes's typical blend of pragmatism and theatricality. "A substitute?" I asked. "A decoy," Holmes replied. He placed a folded note atop the mirror. It bore a simple seal, nothing more than the letter A in red wax. "A forgery?" "A whisper," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "Sometimes all one needs to stir the guilty is a breath of what they buried." The contents of the note he did not reveal, but from the rhythm of his writing, I guessed it was a message composed with particular sting. You intend to display this in the chamber? Yes, prop so it may be seen and misread. And if no one comes, then we are wrong. But we are not. He stood back, surveying the mirror and the forged letter beside it like a stage awaiting its final act. Watson, he said, let us see who trembles when faced with what should no longer reflect. I watched him, uneasy. The game had begun. Holmes said little as we arranged the decoy in the chamber. The candle he lit behind it cast long shadows across the wall, a trick of flame and reflection that made the glass appear to shimmer faintly, as though haunted by movement. He checked every angle, adjusted the drapery, and finally placed the forged letter where it would draw the eye of anyone entering in secrecy. Then he turned to me. We must leave it untouched until midnight. Those who trespass prefer the veil of superstition and the cover of dark. Should we wait outside the door? I asked. No, he said. They would not come if they knew we were near. I have another arrangement. You, Watson, shall retire as usual. I shall take the rest upon myself. And if you are discovered? He allowed himself a smile. Then we shall see whether ghosts are permitted to defend themselves. I hesitated. Holmes, what exactly do you expect them to see? Not what is in the mirror, he said, but what they think is in it. Fear is often a reflection, and I intend to show them theirs. He stepped back, satisfied. Let them look. The truth was once painted. Now it must be faced. Holmes had a particular reverence for the art of suggestion. To him, the mind of the guilty was like a matchbox, dry, brittle, and ready to catch fire when struck with just the right spark. That evening, he lit such a spark with the slow precision of a man setting a theatrical stage. The cracked mirror had been replaced with its untouched twin, mounted where the original had once hung. A single candle flickered behind it, hidden from direct view, but carefully angled to produce shifting glints upon the glass, a clever illusion of movement. Holmes adjusted the drapery to let just enough light spill into the gloom, then stepped back with the faint smile of a conjurer, pleased with his sleight of hand. Upon the mantel he placed the forged letter sealed with the ominous red A. It lay open, temptingly so, on the silver tray Miss Fitzmaurice had earlier used to serve tea. You believe this will lure someone? I asked. It will not lure, Holmes replied. It will compel. He straightened his cuffs. Anyone who feared the truth in that mirror will come not to destroy, but to see if it has returned, and whether it speaks. And with that, he doused the hallway lamp and slipped through the servants' passage. I watched him go, uneasy at how little of the plan I truly understood, and how much Holmes already anticipated what fear would drive a man to do in silence. I did as Holmes instructed, retiring early to preserve the illusion of routine. But sleep evaded me. The atmosphere in Glassford Hall that night was like the lull before a storm, taut with something unsaid. Even the walls, it seemed, held their breath. The corridors outside my room were quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old beams or the distant rustle of the ivy brushing against the windows. At one point, I heard a soft step beyond the door. Not Holmes, whose gait I knew well, but someone lighter, slower, pausing as if to listen. I waited a full hour before risking a glance into the corridor. It was empty, save for the faint smell of candle wax. I returned to my bed, boots on, revolver in the drawer, and sat upright, listening. Below, in the sealed room, Holmes kept vigil. He had refused company, insisted that this trap required solitude. He will come, Holmes had said, when I protested. He has seen ghosts before, but this time he fears one may recognize him. The candle would burn for 3 hours. Holmes would wait for 5. I wondered which would expire first, the flame, the courage of the intruder, or the patience of the detective in the dark. And I feared in my heart that Holmes had prepared for all 3. It was precisely 10 minutes past 2 when a pump Muffled thump roused me. I moved to the corridor in stockinged feet, revolver in hand, and found Holmes already halfway up the staircase, his voice low but urgent. "Stay at the top, Watson," he called. "It is already done." I followed at a distance, and as we reached the drawing room, the scene unfolded before me. In the glow of the now revealed chamber stood Colonel Archibald Thwaite, no longer composed nor proud. His cravat hung askew, his collar wilted, and in his trembling hand he clutched the very letter Holmes had planted. His eyes, wild with something not easily named, flitted from the mirror to Holmes and then to me. "You knew," Holmes said softly. "From the beginning." Thwaite did not deny it. He staggered slightly, then dropped the letter onto the floor with a hand that shook more than age could explain. "I burned the portrait," he said hoarsely. "There was no choice." "Was it your hand that cracked the original mirror?" He hesitated. "I tried to remove it. It shattered in my grip." "Because you saw what it reflected?" Holmes asked. "No," Thwaite whispered. "Because I saw who it reflected." There was silence for a long moment. "You feared the boy's return," Holmes said at last. "And when Edwin began asking questions—" "It was an accident!" Thwaite cried suddenly. "We argued. He slipped. The banister—" He trailed off, staring at the floor. Holmes said nothing, only reached down and lifted the mirror from its frame. "You hid the past," he murmured, "but it was not buried deep enough." Thwaite sat by the hearth like a man awaiting sentence, his back hunched, face buried in one hand, the other clenching his walking cane until the wood groaned. Holmes stood at the window, arms crossed, watching the night shift toward dawn. "I loved the family," the Colonel said at last. "Do you understand that? I served Reginald for 30 years. I fought beside him, bled for him. I could not let it fall apart. Not for a mistake born in a painter's studio." "A child," I said, my voice sharper than intended. "Not a mistake, a life. An embarrassment," Thwaite snapped, then sagged under the weight of the word. Holmes did not move. "You silenced Edwin because he uncovered the truth," I continued, "and you thought the past would die with him." "I didn't mean to kill him," Thwaite said again, more feebly. "He said he'd found the boy's name hidden in the wood frame, said he'd show Helena. I told him to burn the mirror. He refused. We struggled. He fell." Holmes turned then. "And the portrait? Gone. I burned it, but part of it remained. In the mirror, in that cursed room. I should have destroyed it all." "You destroyed enough," Holmes replied. He crossed to the Colonel and set the mirror down beside him. "It will never show you again," Holmes said. "But it no longer needs to." And with that, the sun began to rise. We had scarcely begun to press Thwaite further when a sound shattered the silence. A sharp, unmistakable crack that echoed from the stairwell. Holmes turned on his heel before I could draw breath. I followed without thought, heart pounding. At the base of the main staircase, crumpled against the balustrade, lay Alfred Lane. Holmes reached him first. The painter's face was pale, drawn tight with pain, his coat soaked in dark crimson. A pistol, small and old, lay half spun a few feet away, as if dropped in haste or wrestled from another. "Lane!" I cried, kneeling beside him. "Who?" He raised a shaking hand and clutched Holmes by the lapel. "I saw her. The girl. She has his eyes." "Who shot you?" Holmes asked quietly. Lane opened his mouth, but no word came. He coughed, and a fresh bloom of red stained his cravat. Holmes pressed a handkerchief to the wound and signalled for me. "Through and through, low on the left. Get brandy and tear that curtain." I obeyed without hesitation. As I returned, I saw Holmes kneeling beside the man with that particular cold fury in his eyes I had only seen when justice had been interfered with by a coward's hand. "Watson," he said softly, "someone tried to silence the past, but it appears the past speaks louder than a gunshot, and Lane, pale but conscious, gave the faintest nod before slipping once more into shadow. Holmes and I spent the better part of the following hour tending to the wounded man in the morning room. Helena arrived shortly after, summoned by Holmes through a housemaid. She stared at Lane in astonishment, but said nothing, not until Holmes placed the cracked mirror gently beside the armchair. "This man," he said to her, "did not return to your home to accuse anyone. He returned to remember." Helena looked at the older man with something between confusion and sorrow. "I don't understand." Holmes lifted the mirror slightly. "Your mother once loved this man. She commissioned more than a portrait. She entrusted him with a memory." He stepped aside, allowing Lane to speak. The man's voice was weak, but clear. "I painted him," he said. "A boy, yours, her child, the one she was forced to surrender. I couldn't save him, but I could honor him." "And the mirror?" "Was his frame," Lane breathed. "Hidden behind the glass. His face once looked out." Holmes nodded slowly. "But Thwaite removed the portrait, cracked the glass, and tried to bury what the brush could no longer conceal." Helena turned to Holmes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because," Holmes replied, "it was not mine to tell." Lane smiled faintly. "I wanted you to find it, to ask. The truth should be chosen, not imposed." Helena knelt beside him and took his hand. "He would have been proud," she whispered. Holmes turned away then, not out of emotion, but perhaps, I thought, out of respect for a man who had chosen a palette instead of a pistol, and for whom truth was never shouted, but painted quietly into the corners of things. Later that afternoon, as Lane slept under Watson's careful watch, and Helena remained in the garden with her thoughts, Holmes and I returned to the chamber where it had all begun. The uncracked mirror now lay against the wall, its twin, fractured, emptied, haunted, resting in the centre of the room like a relic from a forgotten dream. Holmes examined the frame once more, his fingers brushing the hidden groove behind the backing. "There was once a face here, Watson," he murmured. "The boy she never knew. A ghost, not of spirit, but of circumstance." "And the figure Helena saw?" I asked. "Reflected memory," Holmes replied. "Human minds crave symmetry. She looked into the glass and saw someone behind her, not real, but imagined, her subconscious attempting to recall what it had never truly known, a brother erased before he could be remembered." He drew out the burnt corner of the canvas, just a curl of linen and a swath of blue. "He's gone, Watson, long gone. Likely died in infancy or was sent far away to be someone else. Thwaite feared his return, but there was no one left to return." I looked at him. "Then what was this all for?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "For remembrance," he said. "For justice, perhaps, or for one man's attempt to preserve a truth too fragile to live, but too powerful to die quietly." He turned toward the door. "The ghost was never in the mirror, Watson. It was in the minds of those who tried to forget." And for once, I could not argue. Thwaite did not resist. He sat in his study, hands folded, gaze hollow. "I had planned to finish it tonight," he said, as though discussing the trimming of a hedge. "Finish what?" Holmes asked. "The last trace, the crate in the library, the second mirror, the rest of the letters, all of it." He looked up. "Do you know what scandal did to a man like Reginald Fitzmaurice, to a name like ours?" "I know what it did to your conscience," Holmes replied. "And to your soul." Thwaite's lips curled bitterly. "A soul cannot be cracked. But reputation, that fractures easily. So we patch, we mend, we conceal." Holmes sat across from him. "But you knew it wouldn't hold. That's why you watched Helena, why you feared Edwin." "I never meant for Edwin to die," Thwaite whispered. "But he wouldn't stop. He said he could feel someone in the house, someone watching him from that glass. He said the mirror wanted to speak." Holmes stood. "It wasn't the mirror, Colonel. It was memory. And memory, unlike glass, cuts both ways. With that, he turned toward the door, and behind us, the man said nothing. He simply stared into the cold hearth, where ash and silence now covered what fire once tried to destroy. The drawing room had the air of a theatre awaiting its final act. Helena sat nearest the fire, her expression uncertain but composed, while Holmes stood before the hearth like a lecturer preparing his closing address. I, ever the loyal chronicler, perched at the edge of a mahogany chair, notebook untouched. "I shall require your full attention," Holmes began, steepling his fingers. "What we are about to lay bare is not merely a tale of inheritance or deception. It is a mosaic of silence and reflection." Helena nodded once. Holmes continued. "The mystery began not with a ghost, nor even with a death, but with a mirror. Specifically, a cracked mirror, behind which once hung a painted portrait. The deception, Miss Fitzmaurice, was not that something was seen, but that something was hidden." He stepped forward and placed a folded paper on the table. "This is Lane's preliminary sketch. Note the composition. A young girl at the centre, a boy to her left. You believed it was a fantasy. In truth, it was a record." Helena paled slightly. "Then I wasn't alone in that painting." "No," Holmes said gently. "You were not. The boy beside you was your twin." She sat back, as though the room had tilted. "I had dreams," she murmured. "Always the same face just behind me." "Not dreams," Holmes said softly, "but shadows. And in this house, Miss Fitzmaurice, even shadows have stories to tell." Holmes moved to the mirror we had recovered from the attic, the one not yet shattered by shame or fire. "This mirror," he said, "is one of a pair. The other, cracked and hidden, was mounted in the nursery room. Behind its backing, as Mr. Lane confirmed, was the portrait." He ran a gloved hand along the seam. "But before we examine the painting further, we must understand its significance." Helena leaned forward. "You said he was my twin." "Yes," Holmes replied. "Your brother, born minutes apart. His name, if you would believe Lane's signature, was Alaric, a name never spoken, a child never registered in any public document. His existence was expunged with astonishing thoroughness. I could not suppress a shudder. But why? Why erase a child?" Holmes turned. "Because his birth threatened to split the Fitzmaurice line, legally, emotionally, and financially. Your father, Miss Fitzmaurice, had promised inheritance to a nephew abroad. 2 heirs would have complicated matters beyond tolerable inconvenience." "But that's monstrous," I exclaimed. "Not monstrous," Holmes replied coolly. "Merely convenient. The boy was either given away or, more likely, died young, but the mere fact of his birth posed a danger to the estate's pristine lineage." Holmes gestured again toward the mirror. "So the portrait was buried, the mirror cracked, the memory smothered in layers of social necessity, and yet—" He looked at Helena. "You remembered. Somewhere in your mind, you always saw his face beside yours, even if the world refused to let it live." The door creaked open, and Colonel Thwaite entered without invitation. He had the look of a man summoned by forces older than time, weary, subdued, but resolved. Holmes did not glance up. "Come in, Colonel. We were just discussing the mechanics of vanishing a child." Thwaite's jaw tightened. "If you intend to accuse me, at least have the decency to do so plainly." "I accuse no one," Holmes said mildly, "but I will illuminate." He stepped closer. "You knew, Colonel. Perhaps not at first, but you found out. Letters, bills, a discarded note in a family Bible, and once known, you chose the path most suited to your ambitions." "I acted to protect the family," Thwaite said. "Indeed," Holmes nodded, "but also to secure your own position. With one heir lost and another deceased, Helena stood to inherit all." but scandal would have destroyed that future. So you buried the past and trimmed the living branches that strayed too close to the truth. Thwaite's gaze did not flinch. I never harmed them, he said quietly. No, Holmes replied, but you misled them. And when Edwin, Helena's brother, began to suspect, you redirected his doubts towards superstition and fear. Holmes turned to us both. Colonel Thwaite is not a murderer, but he is something far more British, a steward of appearances. And in this country, Miss Fitzmaurice, that is often the more dangerous role. Thwaite said nothing. He simply stood beside the fire, letting the warmth do what reputation could not. I had often heard Holmes describe the line between coincidence and motive as a tightrope, where the criminal walked with astonishing balance. But that evening, as we sat in the drawing room's waning light, the balance seemed to waver. Helena's voice broke the silence. Edwin, he used to stare into that room, into the mirror. He told me once he saw someone in it. A child. Holmes nodded. He saw what you saw, what your mind refused to process. A shape, a hint, a sibling lost to time. And like all unresolved echoes, it drove him to question. He confronted Thwaite, didn't he? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. He drew a pocketbook from his coat, Edwin's, recovered from among the Colonel's belongings. This page, he said, notes a meeting, the night before Edwin's death. A name scrawled beside it, T. Helena's breath caught. You believe they argued? I do not believe, Miss Fitzmaurice. I deduce. The fall may have been accidental or convenient, but the truth, I fear, died with him on those stones. Thwaite's voice was dry. There was no struggle. No witnesses, Holmes replied. No bruise, no alibi, only silence. He closed the notebook gently. Whatever happened on that ledge, it was born of secrecy and fear, whether pushed or lost to his own horror. Edwin died because this house refused to speak. Helena rose and walked to the mirror. Then let it speak now, she whispered. And for once, even Holmes did not interrupt. It was near midnight when Holmes addressed the lingering spectre in the room, not of a boy's phantom in the nursery, but of the fear that had haunted them all. You see, Miss Fitzmaurice, he began, there was no ghost. No spirit of a lost child pressing against glass or murmuring through corridors. Helena looked up, her hands folded. Then what did I see? Holmes tapped the mantelpiece gently. You saw yourself and what you had forgotten. Guilt is a curious sculptor. It chisels silhouettes out of memory. The cracked mirror gave back more than your reflection. It gave back the outline of your brother's absence. He paused. And Colonel Thwaite, he added, turning, saw much the same. Only his reflection bore the shape of decision, the things he chose to bury and never speak of. I found myself moved, despite my habitual resistance to Holmes's more poetic turns. So the ghost was only conscience, I asked. Conscience, Holmes said, with the help of clever angles, fading paint, and the suggestibility of a distressed mind, but no less real in its effect. He stepped back from the fire. Ghosts do not haunt houses. They haunt men, especially those who try too hard to silence the past. There was silence then, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards above, as if the house itself, having heard its truth aired, dared to breathe again. I must confess, reader, that while my contributions to Holmes' investigations are often of the supportive sort, fetching papers, interviewing nervous maids, or staunching wounds, it is rare indeed that I provide the key. Yet on this occasion, it was my hand that brushed against the clue. It was in the upper nursery, as Holmes examined the portrait's frame. I had been running my fingers absently along the wood beneath the mirror, an idle habit born of boredom, when I felt a slight indentation. There's something carved here, I murmured. Holmes glanced up. Indeed. He knelt beside me, produced a lens from his pocket, and peered close. Then came the rarest sound in Baker Street history, a short breath of genuine surprise. "Excellent, Watson. Absolutely excellent." I admit, my chest swelled. Holmes traced the carving. Henry. A child's name, etched by a trembling hand, perhaps the painter's or a mother's. The grain of the oak held the truth, and I missed it. "You miss little," I offered. "But I missed this," he said simply. "You saw what I did not, and without any dramatic lighting or deductive display. A small detail, yet it reframes the entire narrative." I could not help but grin. "Then for once, Holmes, the ghost was mine to uncover." He turned to me with that rare glimmer of fondness. "Cherish it, Watson. The spirits seldom leave you anything." The name Henry lingered in the air like a forgotten tune, not loud, but resonant. Holmes stood before the now revealed painting, restored from dust and concealment. His fingers, gloved and gentle, rested on the corner of the canvas. "Henry Fitzmaurice," he said, "born beside Helena, hidden beside her, and alas, perished before her memory could grow teeth enough to hold his image." Helena spoke softly. "I remember, only a lullaby, 2 names whispered. My mother used to say them both. I thought it was a game." "It was a memorial," Holmes replied, "silent and incomplete. Henry was likely promised the title in some provisional will, but his death, sudden and inconvenient, would have upended the Fitzmaurice line, so the record was expunged." "But why the portrait?" I asked. "Why hide it?" Holmes shrugged. "Because it spoke too loudly. A painted truth is harder to smother than ink on a registry. Alfred Lane, whose brush held sentiment in spite of his bitterness, could not bring himself to erase the boy. So he hid him." He turned to Helena. "Your visions, your dreams, they were echoes, instinctive recognitions of a self you never met. The mind, Miss Fitzmaurice, keeps stranger records than any archive." She nodded, tears unshed. "Then I shall remember him properly now," she whispered. "And not in mirrors." Holmes inclined his head. "An admirable sentiment, and one your brother, wherever he resides now, would likely appreciate." The rain had returned by morning. We stood in the parlour as the servants moved quietly through the house, restoring furniture and folding away the dust sheets of secrecy. Holmes looked toward the mirror one final time, the uncracked twin, now cleared of soot and time. "You know, Watson," he said, "a mirror never lies. It merely refrains from commentary." I tilted my head. "How do you mean?" "It reflects what is placed before it. Truth, guilt, memory. It offers them all without prejudice. But when a man chooses not to look, that is where falsehood begins." I thought of Colonel Thwaite, seated in his study with a whisky and blank expression, of Helena walking the grounds alone, as though reacquainting herself with her own shadow. "And yet," I said, "it took deception to bring the truth to light." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "A painter's illusion, a broken pane, a false ghost, all conspired to resurrect what this house had tried so very hard to forget." He slipped on his gloves. "Do you believe in hauntings, Holmes?" I asked. "I believe," he replied, "that the dead rarely knock, but the living, oh, the living hammer away at the walls they built themselves." As we turned to go, I glanced back once more. The mirror offered our likenesses in full, intact, weathered, real, cracked reflections perhaps, but still reflections. And that, Holmes would later remark, is more than most men can bear. It was some days later that I found Holmes ensconced in his armchair at Baker Street, pipe in hand, the late afternoon light cutting patterns upon the Persian rug. He had been silent for nearly an hour, an ominous sign, for Holmes was rarely idle when his mind was clear. "Watson," he said at last, exhaling a thoughtful plume of smoke. Do you know the most enduring motivation behind great crimes? I hazarded a guess. Greed. Greed is vulgar. No, vanity, my dear fellow. A yearning to leave behind a legacy unmarred by blemish. Even the colonel, a man of medals and regulation, feared the tarnish of an unclean lineage more than any court. He stared into the hearth. Men kill for gold, yes, but they lie, suppress, and conceal for something far more elusive, the illusion of honour. And honour, I said quietly, is often bought with silence. Holmes merely nodded. I received a brief note from Miss Fitzmaurice the following week, penned in an elegant hand I scarcely recognised. She thanked us, though her words were cautious, as if she were still weighing the truth she had come to possess. She is returning to London, I told Holmes, apparently to resume her musical engagements. Good, Holmes murmured. The living must return to the business of living. There was something unspoken in that moment. The understanding that, though the dead had stirred, it was the survivor who bore the weight of revelation. I believe Helena would never speak of her brother again. But in some quiet recess of her mind, the ghost she once feared would now sit beside her. Not to haunt, but to be remembered. Holmes regarded the letter for a moment before setting it aside. Alfred Lane, he said, was no assassin. His true weapon was the brush. One stroke of oil upon canvas, and he forced truth into form. You believe he meant Helena to discover it. I believe he hoped she would. Men like Lane do not return for revenge, Watson. They return for resolution. His gun misfired, but his art struck home. There was a certain grim admiration in Holmes's tone. Most people lie with words. Lane chose colour and composition. And the result? A portrait that outlived its subject and condemned its keeper. Holmes tapped his pipe once. Steel may kill a man, but paint, when guided by a steady hand and a guilty memory, can resurrect the dead. Holmes, I asked after a moment of silence, do you believe in ghosts? He did not turn his head. I believe, he said slowly, that the human mind casts its own phantoms, shadows of regret, shame, longing. Whether they wear sheets or whisper in hallways is immaterial. The ghost, Watson, is not in the house. It is in the heart. I let his words settle between us. You're saying Helena wasn't haunted by Henry, but by forgetting him. Holmes gave a rare smile. Precisely. Memory is not a library, it is a stage. And every unspoken truth waits in the wings, costumed and ready. There was a stillness then, the kind that visits only when a case has ended and something more lasting has been uncovered. You see, Holmes said, we all bear ghosts. Some call them secrets, others call them grief. He stirred the fire. But none of them truly vanish. They simply wait to be seen. Just above our fireplace, a small crack ran through the plaster, hidden by a slightly askew mirror. I noticed Holmes inspecting it with idle fingers. I shall have it repaired, I offered. He tilted the glass, revealing a hairline fracture that caught the light like a scar. Leave it, Watson, he said. It reminds me that even this sanctuary is not immune to fractures. I laughed. Another metaphor? Perhaps. Or perhaps I've grown sentimental in my old age. At that moment, a telegram arrived. Holmes scanned it, then handed it to me. Another death? Not yet, he replied. But the vicar of Shropshire reports a curious matter of a coffin too crowded by half. I looked at him. Well then, he said with that infuriating composure, shall we chase ghosts once more? The mirror, cracked but unshattered, caught our reflections as we reached for our coats. And so, another case began. As we sat once more in the familiar haze of Baker Street, Holmes leaned back, his gaze fixed upon the faint crack in the mirror above the hearth. You see, Watson, he murmured, The most enduring phantoms are not those of the grave, but of guilt left to fester beneath varnish and velvet. People will silence others to preserve a name, yet it is their own reflection they fear most. He tapped his pipe thoughtfully. A brush may reveal what blade would conceal. In the end, truth always finds a surface, whether canvas, glass, or conscience. What do you think truly haunted Glassford Hall? The portrait, the mirror, or the secrets they both were meant to hide? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read your theories. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures and pass the tale along to fellow lovers of deduction.